Assalamu alaikum. So today I would be presenting on the topic Maria Montessori's philosophy of education and the nine senses. So without further ado, let's move on to the topic. So the basic idea in the Montessori's philosophy of education was that every child in themselves carries an unseen man or woman that they will become. And in order to develop their physical, intellectual, creative, and spiritual powers to the fullest, they must have a freedom that could only be achieved through order and self discipline. Though at first the world of the child may appear chaotic doing all of these things, it is from this chaos the child must gradually create order and learn to distinguish among the impressions that assail their senses, slowly but surely gaining mastery of themselves and the environment. Okay, a little insight into Maria Montessori's philosophy of education. So, Maria Montessori developed what she called the prepared environment that already possessed a certain order and disposes the child to develop at its own speed, according to their own capacities and in a non competitive atmosphere in their first school years. So, what happens is that when a child develops in a non competitive atmosphere, they are able to experience, they are able to grow in at a more independent in a more independent way than their peers, and the years between 3 and 6 are the years that a child most easily learns the ground rules of human behavior. These years can be constructively devoted to freeing the child through acquisition of good manners and habits to take his place in his culture. Also, the child who had the benefit of a Montessori's environment is freer at a larger age to devote themselves more exclusively to the development of their intellectual faculties. And Montessori recognized that the only valid impulse to learning is the self motivation of the child. The teacher prepares the environment, directs the activity, functions as the authority, offers the child stimulation, but it is the child who learns, who is motivated through the work itself to persist in its given task. Now we would be discussing about Maria Montessori's sensory training. So, as we all know, human beings experience their world through five senses, that is, visual, auditory, olfactory, tactile, and gustatory. Montessori expanded these five senses to include chromatic or color, baric or weight, thermic or temperature, and tactile muscular. She subdivided the five basic senses to provide an opportunity for more detailed refinement of them. This will let the child to interpret and appreciate his world much differently. She had developed certain special apparatus for developing the sensory skills of the children. She developed various child-sized equipment. The equipments were wooden in nature. The main focus in the Montessori's method was on the environment in the classroom. It was Montessori's belief that environment should provide independence and self-directed learning by allowing the child to make their own choices. The teachers are expected to break the activities into small, sequential steps and involve concrete, hands-on types of learning and materials that supports the philosophy. She is well known for the teaching material that she created for the children. As far as purpose of sensory education is concerned, the direct aims of the sensorial activities are to refine the child's senses so that they can differentiate even the slightest differences in order to truly observe and appreciate the world around them. The indirect goals are the mastery of the manipulation of the apparatus and of the terminology involved. Each exercise specifically isolates one sense at a time to minimize its refinement. So, the first among the nine senses that Montessori talks about is the visual sense. The visual sense is interpreted by the eyes. There were exercises that developed visual sense by requiring the eye to perceive differences in size, form, and color. Materials teaching form include the geometric solids, three-dimensional, and the geometric cabinet, two-dimensional. Now, the chromatic sense. Children first distinguish between primary colors, then they move on to secondary, and finally the various gradations of each. These exercises actually allow the child to look at a tree and see many variations of green found in the leaves or the blues and purples of the oceans. The child can truly then perceive the beauty found on this earth. Now, the next is tactile muscular sense. Montessori recognized that while the eye can perceive differences in size and form, the understanding is heightened only when the hand is also engaged. So she believed that the hand was a direct link to the brain. Children are encouraged to look at objects while touching them. They are also encouraged to touch them with closed eyes or a blindfold in order to experience them much in the way a blind person would. Next is the tactile sense. The tactile sense is interpreted through the skin. It is a perception of that which you can touch. Montessori's activities have the child start with touching different grades of sandpaper, then move on to a different materials in the environment. Prior to handling the different materials, the fingertips are sensitized either by vigorously rubbing them on the carpet or dunking them in the tepid water. The sensitization heightens the perception of differences between extra fine and superfine sandpaper and between silk and linen. Next is the thermic sense. The thermic sense takes the tactile sense a step further and teaches the child to distinguish temperature. He determines hot and cold by holding metals bottles in his hands or by touching different kinds of stones and other materials to his cheeks. Knowledge of the thermic sense protects the child from harm. The next is baric sense. The baric sense is feeling different weights. The child again uses the whole arm in conjunction with the hands and the tactile sense to determine light versus heavy. This is done through weighted tablets in the classroom and can translate into other objects in the environment as the child becomes a sort of human balance or scale. The next is the auditory sense. The auditory sense is the interpreting the world through the ears. In order to understand sound, children must first be introduced to silence. Then they can be introduced to matching and grading sounds. Games can be played in which the child is blindfolded and has to identify a person's voice or from where in the room a sound is coming. The next is olfactory sense. The olfactory sense is interpreting the world through the nose by smelling. Children match different herbs or other smells in the smelling bottles. Eventually, more abstract activities takes place that match the scent to a picture. Next and the last is gustatory sense. The gustatory sense is interpreting the world through the tongue by tasting. The child learns to distinguish between sweet, salty, bitter, and sour. Tasting activities can be done in a group, as an individual work, or through food preparation activities. So that was all about Maria Montessori's nine senses. So these are the few sources that I took help from. And thank you so much for patiently hearing. That was all about Montessori's philosophy of education and nine senses.